Indulgence. Hello, and welcome to another exciting episode of Skeptics and Seekers Sunday Sermon Special Edition. Yes, we're going to call this a 5S, and we have a live video panel. Well, I mean, they're live to me anyway. I hope they're still alive when you watch this show. A lively, perhaps I should say, panel. We're doing this on video. And so if you're hearing this on the audio, stop and get to a screen and watch it so that you can see us. I mean, we are four beautiful white men.
Okay.
I feel like the show getting off the rails this early might be partially my fault. So let me.
No doubt about it.
Let me
I'm
see.
darker than you are, Dave.
Is there a prize for spotting which one's the odd one out?
I don't know. I mean, there's one dark spot, and then there's Andrew.
I'm pretty sure one of us. I'm pretty sure one of us isn't beautiful. I can't work which one. Work it out.
So here's what it is. I'm just going to flash this on the screen, and that will remind me to get serious here. This is a special panel on the subject of mental illness. I'm going to go ahead and call out Marvin and thank Marvin for bringing this up on the board. I doubt this is what he had in mind, but that's how I chose to hear it, and I thought that it was a good topic to be discussed. But once I started thinking about it even a little bit, I realized that it was going to require more than the average show. Don't get me wrong, the average show is fucking fantastic, but this has to be better. This has to be better. And
this is the group you collected for that.
No, this is the group that showed up. So
Default setting.
Comedy warning, please.
So here's the thing, though. This is part one. We actually have a full panel. 8 were invited. 7 are going to show. But we had 2 days scheduled for it. And without any cross-communication with anyone, we had 4 people opt for the Tuesday show and 3 others to opt for the Saturday show. And since I'll be on both, it'll be 4 on each show. As it happens, all 4 of us on this first show are skeptics or non-believers. And the 3 on Saturday show, other than me, will be Christians. And so it just kind of broke down as a skeptic show and a Christian show. I assure you, this was not contrived. This is not what anybody wanted on either side. It's just what happened. We just gave people the option to choose what show based on time. No one could see each other's replies. This is just how it happened. So that said, I still think it's going to be a fantastic couple of shows. But when you watch this show, you have not heard the last word on this subject. So stay tuned for the next show in a few days. I'm just going to open this up with a little bit of a statement, and truly a little bit of a statement. I just want to start by saying I am not an expert on this subject. I do not pretend to be an expert on this subject. I have not even watched many experts on this subject on TV. So I don't even know what expertise looks like in this field. I've read my share of things, but I must tell you that the subject of psychology, psychiatry, mental health, it's very dense. And it's very hard for laymen to really wrap their minds around it and understand it. I think I've got a better shot at understanding astrophysics than this, quite frankly. And so this is going to be one of those shows where you see a different side of me. If you wonder if I have a humble bone in my body, those are the only ones showing up for this show. Because I simply don't know what the hell I'm talking about. I know how I feel. I know what I think and what I've synthesized from a bit of study, but I am well aware that it is insufficient for the task. And I suspect that the other 3 on this panel are going to be similar, but I will let them speak for themselves. This stuff is fucking hard. It's uncomfortable. And it is no more comfortable for me than it is for any of the other panelists, for anyone listening. It's not more comfortable for skeptics than Christians or vice versa. This is the reason I wanted to have a mixed panel is because this is an issue that touches us all quite equally. And so this is how I'm approaching this. And I'm just going to go ahead and start by saying a thing that I wrote in my write-up. By the time you're hearing this, you'll be able to read my write-up. The panelists have already seen it, but I'm just going to begin with the sincerest apology that I know how to make for tossing around accusations or implications of mental illness at people that I've had no right to do that or say such a thing or make such implications. My suspicions are not diagnoses, and the subject is too sensitive to be careless and callous. We have to do a much better job at being more charitable and less callous about something that is so sensitive to us all. The other thing that I want to do in my opening statement is begin by definitions. Now, I am not providing the definition of mental illness. I want to make this clear. I'm not even trying to provide the definition of mental illness. What I am trying to do is tell you what I think of, what I have traditionally thought of as mental illness, how I have traditionally defined it. And, you know, maybe you can identify that as some of why my opinions about it are wrong. But this is how I have thought about it. And so I want to share that definition with you and talk a little bit about what it's not. And then I'm going to open it up to the others if they would like to start with an opening statement. So the way I have traditionally viewed mental illness is very tautological. Mental being of the mind and illness being unwell, a state of unwellness. And so I think of someone who is mentally ill as someone who is unwell in their mind. Now, it has occurred to me by the little voices in my head that this definition is insufficient. The voice in my head has a name, and we had a pre-show conversation about this. I'm not going to say which one of the panelists that might be, but I understand that my definition is insufficient and does not help. It is not diagnostically useful. It does not help in any way, but you have to understand where I'm beginning. When I think of any illness, mental or otherwise, I start with the idea of unwellness. Now, the difference between mental illness and, say, cardiac illness, heart illness, is we know what a healthy heart looks like. We know how a healthy heart should behave. And so we have some very clear ideas of what wellness means for the heart. I think we have less of an idea of what that means in matters of the mind. I certainly have less of an idea. I don't know what mental wellness means. And you'll notice in my write-up, I didn't do anything to try to define it. What I did try to do was take away some of the things that mental illness could mean. We use it so cavalierly, and it's important to understand what it is not. But I don't know what mental wellness actually is. And so I hope that during the course of this conversation in the comments, because this will be in the comments for weeks, I'm sure, you, the audience, and you, the panelists, can help me form a better and more useful understanding and definition of what's going on. So I want to say that two things. Mental illness is not, this is me. Don't take this as diagnostic. Mental illness is not being wrong. It's not being wrong. We're all wrong about things. And in fact, we're all wrong about things that to other people, the right answer is perfectly obvious. They might say that we are mentally ill, that we're way off base. And but we're not mentally ill. We're just ignorant. And ignorance is not mental illness. We need to read another book. We need to watch another documentary. We need to educate ourselves further. Being wrong is not being mentally ill, and yet being wrong about certain things could be a symptom. So it can be hard to say. Another thing that I don't think mental illness is being socially awkward. Being socially awkward is not mentally ill. If you walk down New York City and you sing show tunes at the top of your lungs, and that's not mentally ill. It's just New York. I think it's mentally ill. I mean, it seems mentally ill to me, but that's actually not mental illness. You're just doing something that is socially aberrant, but maybe in another society it wouldn't be socially aberrant. So I don't think that you can say that that's mental illness. It might be a symptom of mental illness, but it's not. So there are many things like that. Certain behaviors that we think, oh, that's crazy. We have to be more careful than that. Behaviors in and of themselves do not suggest that a person is mentally ill. A person might be mentally ill by doing such behaviors, but that in and of itself is not mental illness. And we just have to slow way down when we're interacting with one another and someone says something that sounds crazy or it presents in a socially awkward way. This is when our charity and humility needs to kick in, because whatever mental illness is, I'm fairly sure that ain't it. So that said, I'm gonna hold Andrew for last here. So I'm gonna go to Clint. Clint, if you have an opening statement that is shorter than mine, you are welcome to make it.
Yeah. Well, about mental illness, I was actually curious about the context that led to this discussion in the first place. Did you mention that one of your listeners wrote in and asked about if we could discuss the topic of mental illness? Because what led to that discussion in the first place? Because as you're saying, this is a quagmire. This could be a minefield because none of us are psychiatrists, none of us are psychologists. So what was it that occasioned this conversation? Why are we here? Because we were talking before the show about mental health and religion, which is something I'm personally fascinated by as an ex-Christian. And I think we're probably going to get into that, and there's going to be a furious debate probably among your Christian panels when we say some of the stuff that we say about what we think might be considered a mental illness or something like that, or mental health around religion. So I'm curious to know, how did this discussion come about in the first place?
Okay, first of all, Clint, you have not grasped the spirit of the opening statement.
That's true.
This is not a question. It is not a conversation.
Right.
It is a statement. However, you have forfeited your opening statement and foolishly asked me a question. That is the wrong move. And so I will say it wasn't a write-in. It was someone in the comments. It was Marvin. We all know Marvin. He used to be one of the Christian moderators on the Skeptics and Seekers board. I still enjoy talking to Marvin. I think that he's a good chap. And, we've had our differences, bitter differences, public differences. But I like Marvin, despite myself. So I don't remember exactly the context of the conversation, but he brought it up, and I thought it was worth latching onto and taking some time with. So that's really how this came up. Now, if you would like to make a statement that is not a question, you may do so. Now's your chance. You've got another 30 seconds.
I was just thinking about, that it's, as I said before, it's a potential minefield because A, none of us are experts, and B, the whole field of mental illness, mental health is hotly debated. For example, someone could be diagnosed with a clinically diagnosable let's say a mental illness. Like I've got a relative who's clinically diagnosed with OCD. He's obsessive compulsive, and he's on medication, which seems to help him. So can you point to that and say, yes, that's a definite instance of a mental illness that's actually treatable with medication, but when you get into mental health, I think that's another rabbit hole that I'm sure we're going to get into. So I don't know if that's an opening statement or not, but I'm just going to set my table out and just say, I think this is a potential minefield, but I think I'm looking forward to this discussion, especially
Yeah.
when we get into mental health and religion.
So the reason I'm holding Andrew last is because I know that he has some things to say about formal definitions and things like that. He's done a bit
Mm-hmm.
of research here. This is a field that he's put a lot of time in over the years. And so we're going to springboard off of his statement to launch into some general discussion. But before we do that, Matthew?
Thank you, David. I'm always honoured and appreciate it when you invite me onto something, because I consistently think that my opinions are just noise, but you consistently tell me that my opinions are occasionally worth listening to. So thank you for that, David. And that's a positive step for my own mental health, which brings us into this thing. I feel not only underqualified, but insufficient in having this kind of conversation. But I do have a little bit of experience around mental health, both personally and with those that I know. And we can probably get onto this later in the conversation about signs of degrading mental health and what to do about it. But before we get to that, my opening statement, this is going to be a clumsy analogy, but for me, I think it works. Let's imagine that mental health is something akin to walking. And the reason why I'm using this analogy is if you look at people walk, different people walk in different ways. And again, mentally, different people think, different people's mental cognition works in different ways, but it doesn't mean that one is the perfect one. Everyone is different. Everyone processes things different. It's a function of the biology that makes up our brains. Our brains are wired differently through our life experiences. Therefore, we think and we process differently. Again, equivalent to walking, our bones and our flesh is different in each individual person, and therefore we walk very subtly, very slightly differently. And additionally, different things can affect how we walk. You could have damage to a hip, damage to a knee, damage to an ankle, different lengths in some of your bones, etc. All of those could affect your gait and make it harder or painful or awkward. You might walk with a limp, you might have one stride longer than the other. All of these will affect the way you walk. And then similarly, there are multiple ways in which the way our brain works can be affected. It can be utterly distressing news that really focuses our mind onto something unpleasant, and it, to the extent that it affects our ability to do other things. It could be something chemical, it could be physical damage. There are many different things that can affect the way our brain works. None of them will have the same effect, but they'll all have the effect of degrading our mental processes from what we are used to. It's not worth comparing them to somebody else. It's comparing them to what our brain used to be like. So that is this is why mental health is a really big subject. Not every problem has a single solution. And we need to, and this goes straight back to what you said about having thought and having grace and having charity about how people have issues with their mental health, because there could be one of a multitude of things that affect that. If somebody comes in to the office and you haven't seen them for a couple of weeks, they're instantly in a bad mood. There could be many reasons for them being in a bad mood, from as small as somebody cut them up on the driveway outside to something as big as a loved one dying the day before. And we don't know that until we've had that interaction with them. So a little bit of compassion in the way that people think. If people are visibly behaving differently to how they used to be, then be nice to them, because there could well be a very serious explanation behind it.
Andrew, round us out.
All right. So, first of all, I want to open much like Matthew did. You guys are my people, and you make my life better. So I appreciate being able to share a mic with you. That said, let's let the disagreements begin, because they're probably going to. Mental health it's a hard topic. It's really hard. So in preparation for the show, I thought, well, I really want to know what the professionals have to say about what mental illness is. By the way, just a sound check. The mic's working okay?
Sounds great.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. So I decided to dig into where the professionals hang out. Where are the professional dugouts in mental health? Well, the American Psychological Association, the World Health Organization, the Mayo Clinic. These are folks that we can reasonably think are well positioned to offer a definition on what mental illness is. And with very little disagreement, they say something like this: mental illness is a health condition that is like heart disease or any other illness. But mental illness affects our behavior, emotions, and thought. Behaviors, emotions, and thought. And they disturb our ability to interact in our normal social circumstances: work, family, public gatherings. And that mental health can be temporary or it can be long term. And that everyone can fall to a mental health crisis. It's interesting that the COVID-19 pandemic actually pushed the incidence of mental illness in the United States up from about 19.5% to about 21.5%. So, what can we say about mental illness that makes us confident that those kinds of numbers are meaningful? If we say 1 person in 5 in the United States is mentally ill, well, why would we have any confidence in those kinds of numbers, right? Clint, you sort of said something about that. Maybe there's some disagreement. Well, the mental health professionals use the same tools to arrive at concepts of mental health that we see otherwise in science. Well, especially biology, genetic studies, twin studies, comorbidity studies, meta studies, brain scans. These are the things that help us today identify what mental illness looks like. And double blind studies are particularly interesting in mental health. So the APA, when creating the DSM-5 TR that came out this year, the DSM is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. TR is just text revision. The first DSM-5 came out in 2013. There have been 8 of them since 1952, but these double-blind studies invited clinicians to look at a set of facts about a patient and to assess, based on the facts, what sort of mental illness that patient might have. And as it turns out, because of the hard science work done in the last 2 decades, the disagreement among actual clinicians when faced with a set of facts about someone's mental health is remarkably small. It's remarkably small. And so we think of mental health as this sort of wild, wild west soft science. But that is much less true today. In fact, the International Classification of Diseases, some of you will be familiar with ICD codes from your own medical records. You had a knee surgery. What was the ICD code that the insurance company's billing against? Well, as it turns out, mental health conditions are so well defined now that there are mental health codes in the International Classification of Diseases, version 11. So the idea that mental health is this sort of rough and ready thing that maybe we experienced in the DSM-1 back in 1952, or maybe in the DSM-3 in 1988. You know, maybe those days were a little more rough and ready. Maybe there was a lot more disagreement. But today, our clinicians are quite well trained and use the tools of science that all four of us would defend in order to make assessments about mental health. And that will lead me to this last statement. Mental health conditions are health conditions. And I'll leave it there so that we can move on into the conversation and talk about it a little more.
Okay. So let me jump in here. This will be a little bit of a free-form conversation for the next little bit, but I'd like to stay on the subject of definitions for a little bit if we can. I think this is good and useful information, Andrew. It doesn't meet with my intuition, but my intuition doesn't mean spit. And I am curious about the intuition of the other panelists because my intuition is that that mental health issues are still closer to the Wild West than they are to cardiology. Now, once again, I am not doubting anything that you've said, and I will just take it as an education that I find hard to process all at once. But that hasn't been my sense of it. And so I'm curious, Clint and Matthew, what do you feel like mental health is pretty well defined like other health issues, or are you as wrong as I am in thinking that it's more Wild West than it actually is?
Do you want to go, Matthew? I've got some thoughts on it as well.
Okay, Ryan, I'll go. I think it's well defined by the professionals who eat, sleep, and drink this, and have studied this, and have got decades of experience under their belt. I think for the layperson, for a person like me, who is concerned about other people, I think it's far more woolly. It's much easier for me to be able to see if someone's got a physical injury than if they've got a non-physical injury. If my daughter comes running up to me and her hand is bleeding and she says she's cut herself, it's much easier for me to see there what I need to do, how serious it is, whether it's something I can patch up at home or whether it's something I know to go and seek a doctor for. If she comes up to me and says she's feeling a little bit sad, I have absolutely no idea how serious that might be, what the triggers for that might be, whether I need to go and see help on that, or whether she literally just needs a couple of hours of daddy's company to go and watch a silly movie together or something like that. The knowledge and experience that I have and the reference points that I have for diagnosing is obviously the wrong word, but for appreciating the state of somebody's mental health when they come up to me are completely insufficient. So I think, to answer your question shortly, in well-defined, for someone like me, really hard to tell, and I don't know how that can be adjusted quickly.
Yeah, and I would jump on that to say I think I like Andrew's definitions, and I think it does help clarify the situation. But one thing about this is, okay, diagnostically, let's say a psychiatrist or a psychologist could accurately diagnose a client's problem. So I recently went through the book "The Body Keeps the Score" by Bessel van der Kolk. I don't know if anyone's read it, but it's all about the treatment of trauma, things like PTSD. And he was a pioneer in the field of treating trauma. Now, you might be able to, a clinician might be able to diagnose a person with, let's say, PTSD. And this is how he got into the study of trauma. He was a young psychiatrist, and he was working out of Massachusetts. And he started treating a Vietnam veteran who had severe PTSD. Now, the symptoms are fairly easy to point out and say, okay, this guy's suffering from PTSD. He's a combat veteran. He lost his friends in the jungles of Vietnam. He struggles every year, all the rest of it. Now the question is, what's the treatment? And I think that's where you start falling down, because what Vanderkolk argues is that talk therapy, which is a model that most clinicians still use even today, is not necessarily effective when it comes to treating advanced or CPTSD, things like that. And what he's found is treatments like internal family systems and EMDR are sometimes far more effective at treating things like PTSD. And I think that's where psychiatrists and psychologists and therapists might argue it is a little bit more woolly, because depending on what model you're attached to in terms of treatment, that's where you could run into some trouble, I think, as far as how to, whether you or treat it with medication. And his argument is actually medication for PTSD actually suppresses the symptoms. It might make you feel better. It might actually make you interact with others a little bit better, but it's not actually treating the core problems, the psychological problems that are underlying what's causing you to act out in certain ways. So I think that's where some of the disagreement comes in terms of how we treat these mental health issues.
But I don't think we actually. I don't think there's anything surprising. So first, let me.
Andrew, we lost you
I might have
there.
lost you.
Okay,
We
no.
lost your audio. Okay, could you go back and just say the last 30 seconds there, Andrew? We lost that.
Yeah, sure. So, Clint, I think that what you've said is, I think there's plenty of analogy between what you describe in the mental health world and what you might see between oncologists
Yeah, sure.
treating a rare form of cancer. So I don't think that's particularly surprising. But I want to say something first about what Matthew had to say, because I think it's really important. Matthew said, my daughter comes to me and she has a cut or a scrape, and I know what to do. Okay, I agree. But you're not comparing apples to apples as far as I can tell. Because if your daughter came to you and said, I feel bad, and you can't figure out what's wrong, and it turned out to be a blood condition, that would be something that you couldn't see and that you would need special tools to diagnose. And you'd actually have to take her to a doctor to have her assessed. And mental health is not different than that. Yes, what's going on in the brain is hidden from us in the same way that blood disorders are hidden from us. So I want to ask a question of all three of you, because we're all of a certain age. I am guessing that every one of you has seen a doctor and had to get a second opinion for some kind of condition. Dave just went through some pretty serious accident. David, I don't know if you had more than one doctor, but
I
you
did.
might have gotten a second opinion here and there. And it's this openness about our uh, physical ailments that people can see that gives us good information about what we think of as medicine. So now I'll ask you the second rhetorical question. When was the last time either one of you got a second opinion on a mental condition? Hell, when was the last time you got a first opinion? Of course, we know less about it. We're scared of the topic. In fact, this show opened up with us being afraid and acknowledging some fear about the topic, and especially in the run up. Okay, those are my thoughts.
Well, all right. I concur with Matthew's feelings about it, and I think he was pretty clear about saying that he agreed with the assessment that clinicians would
Sure,
they would have clarity, but it is
he was.
something way more opaque to the layman. we don't know how to assess mental states well, and I think it's going to be a long time before we do. And I also agree with your response to that, which is yeah, but there are a lot of physical states that are not obvious that you would have to go to a doctor for. I think the difference between the physical states and mental states is that there are lots of physical states that are obvious. And so
Sure.
you like the cut on the hand. Okay, we can see that. We can see how deep the cut is. We've got some Band-Aids, some peroxide, some. There are things that we can do. Even the least skilled among us, if you've grown up enough so that you are now having kids, you've had enough cuts treated so that you know how to treat it. And yet, you can grow to that age and twice as old and not know what to do when someone is sad.
I don't know. I don't know if I agree with that. So the the National Institute of Mental Health (NIMH) they classify mental disorders into groups: AMI, which is any mental illness, and a subset of those, which is SMI, which is serious mental illness. Now, not every episode of sadness, not every episode of sadness is mental illness. But then again, not every cut on the hand requires stitches. And so I think that to some extent we do have some programming to help people through normal sorts of mental stress. Now, I'll be the first one to say that I have no idea. I have no idea whatsoever when a normal mental stressor reaches some definition of clinical importance so that it can be classified as mental illness. That's where the training comes in, right? And but likewise, we don't always know when our kids need stitches.
Isn't
So
isn't part of the problem though that at least as I'm thinking about it now, it seems like part of the problem is that we all humans go through some brand of mental illness, at various times in our lives, and we might move in and out of it fluidly. So I'm thinking about a scene in the first J.J. Abrams Star Trek reboot. I hate that I have to use so many qualifiers for this, but it's the one where Vulcan got blowed up real good. And if you haven't seen it by now, you're not a Star Trek fan, and I don't care if I just spoil it for you. So honestly, you don't deserve
Spoiler
my
alert.
respect, none Star Trek
Star
fans.
Trek doesn't deserve fans.
So, but in that movie, the young Spock was, he had gone through that too, and he was the one in line to take command because Pike had gotten captured by the Romulan crazy guy, and old Spock was talking to Kirk and saying, "Look, I don't care how it seems. I assure you that I am emotionally compromised, and you need to take command of the ship." And he was saying that about his younger self. He's emotionally compromised, and that stuck with me because there are plenty of times when I have felt so emotionally compromised. Well, not plenty, but sometimes when I have felt so emotionally compromised where I needed to hand the reins off to someone else, that my opinions couldn't be trusted because I was too compromised to do it. And I think that we all, whether we recognize those moments or not, move in and out of those stages. And so we don't tend to call that mental illness, and I don't know if we should or not, but I'm thinking now maybe we should.
yeah, it's how do you know when you see so poorly that you need to give up your driver's license? Right? It's a hard thing for older people. We all have older adults in our lives. Some of them need to surrender their driver's license. They don't think they do. How do we know when we're so mentally ill that we need that we need to find a couch and sit on it? I don't have good answers there. I'm
Well,
not that guy. We need a
yeah.
specialist.
I think too, it's an issue when we are dealing with someone else who we may suspect has some mental health issues. Like going back to my example, I've got a relative who's OCD. Now, this guy's, I've worked with him a few times, and he's impossible to work with. I'm a carpenter, I'm a builder by trade. I know what I'm doing. I've had over 25 years experience in the building trades, and he's a pilot. That's what he does for a living. But he's absolutely insufferable. I cannot work with him. You know, he's so OCD. Now the problem that I have is I might be able to diagnose what's wrong with him in terms of mental health. He's got OCD, but he won't hear anything. He won't hear any criticism. He won't go. He won't, as Andrew said, he won't seek that couch. He won't take his medication. He won't. You know, so he it impacts everyone around him with his OCD and his personality. It's really hard to deal with. You know, so that's another layer, I think, on top of this issue, isn't it? Where we might suspect someone has an actual diagnosable mental health disorder or issue, and they won't get any sort of treatment or help for it. What do we do as friends, family, loved ones? That's another whole layer, I think, too, isn't it?
So I'm going to jump in here, and Matthew, you can have the mic after this. But I think I've got a video clip queued up, and I was going to do a 4S of this before this show, but I never got around to it, and so this might be saved for the following week. But I want to play a clip because the Christian, the preacher here, I can't remember his name, is talking about this and saying something that kind of dovetails with what we're saying here. Not everything that he says is horrible here. Some of it is. So let me play this clip and let's talk about it, because I think one of the things that he says is not horrible is that we need to be real and honest about mental health, starting with our mental health. And I know that I am a person who has avoided thinking about his own mental health. I just assume I'm okay. That's not always true, but let's hear this and maybe have some discussion around it. And I think that it will lead into the subject that Clint wanted to speak to as well. So here we go. This is not very long.
He said he hated his family for it. He said he was certain every day he woke up that it was their problem. He said it took him 6 months for him to consider, maybe I'm the problem.
So he's talking about a person who was deep into drugs, I think, and his family did a hard intervention on him, and they just took him and locked him down for, for 6 months. And so that's kind of the lead into what he's saying here.
He said that was the day he decided to be honest and embrace healing. But it started with him. It started by saying, I think I have a problem. I think I have a problem. Jesus is not afraid of your problem. But he will not allow you to heal until you get real.
Now, that I find somewhat terrible when we get to some of the more terrible stuff, because the moment you start inserting religion into this, your message goes awry. Jesus is not pulling the strings on, whether or not you will be healed from your mental illness based on your mental states and whether you're ready to admit it or not. So
Getting real.
Some of you, here's the truth. You're more concerned with what I think about you than you are your own mental healing and well-being.
This much is true.
Isn't that crazy? We're more concerned with the image of health than we are with authentic health, real healing. So what did Jesus do? He's not afraid. He's not afraid. This is a problem. And that's how your healing starts today. You come forward at the end for prayer.
Okay.
Our church can pray over you.
Do not come forward for prayer. Christians or non-Christians, if you're suffering, if you believe, if you are ready to confront your own mental health issues. I say this very seriously. Going forward for prayer is not a solution. Let's let him finish this statement out there.
Church can help you identify a counselor. Our church can help you identify someone in soul care to come alongside you, to pray with you, to begin your journey of healing. But we can't help you if you're not real. Man, I would just encourage so many of you today, man, make the move. Even if you're watching online, just say, I need help. Because we care about you and we love you. And Jesus loves you. And whatever it is that you're battling, Jesus is bigger and he's better. And he can handle it.
Okay. So, there's a mix of, good, solid advice and bullshit in there. And I think I would identify the bullshit parts as the parts that are very specifically religious. Surprise, surprise, that I would think that. But I promise to hand the mic off to Matt first, and then Clint, I will let you take it away.
Well, I feel it comes a little bit out of that video, but this is something I was thinking about before we even got to there. Sometimes I think the language that we use around mental health can itself be the problem. We use words like mental illness or poor mental health. And those words, those phrases, certainly to me, and I am going to make the assumption that it's also true for a great many other people. But to me, those words jump immediately from somebody who is, inverted commas, mentally normal to somebody who is no longer capable of functioning mentally adequately. And I think that's not true. And I think using a phrase like mental illness is potentially problematic there. Because illness brings up words like disabilitating. If someone is ill with a physical illness, you automatically assume that they are physically incapable of living their life normally. They might be so bad they can't get out of bed. It might be so bad they can't commute to work. It has that kind of an impact on their life. And so when we say mental illness, I think we're at risk of giving the impression that that person is no longer capable of functioning mentally in a coherent way. They're almost worthless in outside society. And that's also not true. And I do sometimes wonder if some of the phrases that are used around mental health don't give enough nuance, don't give enough room for the gentle issues that we might have in mental health. Clint brought up the person he knows with OCD. OCD has been in the public domain for a long time. We've known about people with OCD for a very long time. It's probably one of the earliest mental health conditions that we've been able to diagnose and treat and know what the symptoms are. But even that still invokes fear in some people about interacting with somebody who might have OCD, or even fear about the medication that people might take to help correct that. So my concern here is about the language. To go back to the walking analogy I used up earlier, walking with a limp doesn't have to be debilitating. Yes, it means you make progress slower. Yes, it means you will stand out because people will see you've got a funny gait, but it doesn't have to stop you driving. It doesn't have to stop you doing your job. It doesn't have to stop you doing everything in your life. You might be a bit slower in some places. And there are probably, let's drop the probably. There are hiccups that we will have in our mental health that will be the same. We might be just a little bit different. We might be a little bit more prone to being wound up, or we might have a slightly shorter fuse than normal, or we might pay slightly less attention to things that we're normally really focused on. But in the grand scheme of things, we're not debilitated. We're not ill. We're not incapable of functioning life normally. We're still capable of doing everything else. We might just be a little bit slower at some things. Now, this goes back to the whole thing about grace and compassion we were having earlier. So I do have a concern sometimes about the kind of language that we use, because it kind of gives the impression that we're normal and everything's great. Then we get mental illness and we've crossed the line. And it's much more grey than that. It's much more scaled than that. And that was just what I wanted to bring up.
I appreciate you saying that. I'm legally blind. I have a disability. I am disabled, but I do not have a total incapacity to perform human functions. And it is very hard to explain to people who have a lack of understanding of disabilities that no, I can do that. I'm capable of doing that. I can hold a job. I'm good. I can think clearly. I can, all of the things that you expect a person who does not have this disability can do. I can do. I cannot drive your bus. Okay, so I do have to be realistic about some of the things that I cannot and should not do. But yeah, there's quite a bit of nuance here, and until we run into one of my hard limits, you shouldn't assume that I have them.
Hey, fellas, I have got to bail out. We've got a little bit of got a little bit of stuff going on here at the house that I need to attend to, and I've been at this since about 1:30. So I'm going to bail, and
All right.
my apologies for having to do that at this time. Thanks for letting me join you guys. I appreciate all three of you, and I'm looking forward to getting to talk to each of you again soon.
We'll
Okay,
see if
so
we
you got
can.
to go,
Thanks,
Andrew.
Andrew.
Let's
Yeah,
catch up soon.
we'll see if we can't catch on an after show of some kind. So we'll
All right.
we'll catch up.
All right.
right.
Appreciate you guys.
All right, Clint.
Yeah, I'm glad you played that clip, David. I don't know who the preacher was, but I agree with you. The problem is it's a mix of like good advice, common sense stuff, some truths, and then the bullshit comes in where he's attaching a certain clinical model of mental health treatment with religion, as you say. Because, like for example, my example of my relative, if he'd have turned around and said, "Look, okay, you know what? You're right. I think I am the problem. I think my OCD is affecting the relationships around me negatively. I could be the problem here. I think I need to seek treatment and therapy and all that." Okay, I'm with you to that point, which is what he said. Maybe I'm the problem. Then he turned around and said, Jesus isn't going to help you, or Jesus can't help you until you decide to get real, and then you can seek Christian counseling and everything else. And that's the problem, is that no matter how real you want to get, what does that even mean? And there's a model, which is it's called nouthetic counseling, and it's basically the idea that uh, if you come to Jesus with your mental health problems and your traumas and everything else, when you uncover the roots of the traumas, the Holy Spirit will heal you. And that may be the model he was talking about. Like, you have to admit that you have issues and problems, at which point God will heal you of your problems, mental health problems. And the thing about the church is they're always praying for physical healing, the Benny Hinn's, the Peter Papas, the Kenneth Copelands of the world. But who's coming to the Benny Hinn conference saying, I've got schizophrenia, I've got bipolar disorder, I've got OCD. Can you heal me, Benny, of my OCD?
That's
No,
such a
I
good
need
point. I can't believe I never thought about that.
I've never heard anyone come to Benny Hinn and say, I've got schizophrenia or OCD, I need healing. We in the church, it's a lot of traditions. They shy away from talking about things like even depression, and depression's like a taboo subject, or even getting on medication to deal with anxiety and depression and lack of sleep and things like that. A lot of places they'll say, well, you just have to pray, you have to get Christian counseling, whatever. So even in many churches, the whole subject of mental health is a minefield as well.
Yeah, so we've all been former Christians. We've all been former. We are all former Christians. We've all been
We are.
Christians.
Still am, yes.
And I maybe you can share some of your some of your history with the Christian thought on this. One of the things that I called Andrew about earlier this week to get some clarification on is what is the Christian perspective on mental illness, just from his perspective. He went to seminary. I doubt that they ever talked about it there, but I know that from my perspective, our church, we didn't talk about mental illness at all. It was a non-subject. I don't think it ever came up. If it did, it would have come up in the context of people seeking answers for mental health issues in all the wrong places when they should be coming to Jesus and laying their burdens on him instead of trying to pawn it off on appeal. And then some people would talk about mental illness as in the form of demonic oppression. That's it's the demons that has got their mind clouded, or their spirit is clouded. But it seems like there was very little acceptance of the idea that you're just having some very physical human problems with the mind that could be addressed in very straightforward medical ways. It's always some kind of spiritual overlay. So churches that, now let me just say, the more liberal of the churches, the more liberal the Christian is, the more likely they're able to accept the idea that mental illness is mental illness. The preacher that you heard, the story that he was basing his sermon on was of the demoniac who was possessed by Legion, that set of demons that was then tossed into the pigs. And he was perfectly happy to describe that situation as the man was mentally ill. That's how he was perfectly happy to talk about that. In the churches of Christ that I knew, they didn't talk about it like that. It was a demon. So anyway, that said, I did not grow up hearing the language, any healthy language of mental health. And so, how about you two? How did you hear about it? With your church backgrounds, and how did that affect you, if at all?
You go
Go ahead,
first.
Matthew. Well, I would say I agree with you, David. I think it's a lot of it is ascribed to some sort of spiritual or cause or issue. So and you were saying in your write up about how many instances in the New Testament where Jesus, in the narrative anyway, whether or not it's historically true, we can set that aside, whether or not he actually cast a demon out of a person, because that's what the narrative presents. He says, you've got what we would describe today as some form of mental health problem. You're throwing yourself into the fire. That's a serious problem. Well, the problem is the guy's got a demon or whatever. So Jesus casts the demon out, and bam, the man is in his right mind. And the demons go into the pigs. They hurtle off the cliff, and the man is in his right mind, and everyone's shocked and amazed that he's now talking and walking normally and interacting completely normally. And obviously, the problem was he was filled with demons. And once Jesus cast the demons out, his mental health problems went away, just like that. So what do we do with that? In our modern science, we would say it's probably he was schizophrenic, or he was whatever his issue was. It wasn't a demon. So how do we get around that issue? And then I think the other issue is what I was talking about earlier. When I was in Bible college, I took Introduction to Christian Counseling, and it was presented as that Jay Adams model, where it was the whole thing about uncover your traumas, and then God, the Holy Spirit, will heal you, thereby freeing you of most, if not all, of your mental health problems. And so a lot of Christian counseling is going to go down some sort of line like that, what's your sin problem? What's the issue in your life that's causing this spiritually? There could be any number of reasons from a spiritual overlay, like you said, and we've got to get to the root of the problem. And that's some sort of spiritual issue generally. And I think that's a completely wrong-headed approach to mental health.
Matt?
My attitude towards mental health when I was a Christian was very unhelpful. I think it's probably the most charitable way to put it, which is unfortunate given my history in that arena. I'm going to give a mini testimony. I'm going to make it as brief as I possibly can, because it helps to set the scene. So I think one of the things that I've seen Christians do, and so I'm just trying to get comfortable here. One of the things I've seen Christians do is, with regards to mental health, is jump to an interpretive conclusion based on their personal experience, and their personal past experience informs the decisions they make. And I think that's a feature of the layperson's knowledge of mental health being so poor that people insert their own experience because of lack of better professional experience in the frame. And I've seen Christians who are genuine, caring, loving Christians who I would never say a horrible thing about, Christians who I would trust with all sorts of things about me personally, go to a fearful, literally start exhibiting fear as soon as someone close to them starts talking about having poor mental health, because they feel so ill-equipped to be able to handle it. Their first response is a fear panic, and that's not because of Christianity. That's just because of who they are as people. You don't have to be a Christian to have that experience. So I'm not linking that specifically to Christianity, but I think it's just a feature of the lack of layperson's knowledge in the area. So what did I want to talk about? As a young teen, I came from a broken home, and that absolutely killed my mental health. When looking back now, I can see that the vast majority of my teenage years I was depressed, but I didn't know it at the time, and nobody treated me as though I had it at the time. So it took me a huge number of years into adulthood to actually properly recover from that. And as a result, for most of those adult years, I had a really, really difficult and problematic relationship with my father. And all this comes out of that unhelpful relationship with mental health that I had as a teenager. That Christianity had, coming from a very fundamentalist Christian background. Mental health, like you two said, pretty much talked about zero. Maybe because that was in the 70s and the 80s and nobody was talking about mental health then. So I want to be careful not to point at Christians and blame them for things that aren't their fault necessarily. So anyway, into my 20s, things come to a head. I've been encouraged to counselling by some close friends who are Christians. It took me an awful long time to eventually concede to go to counselling. Yes, of course, it was a Christian counsellor. Were they professional to the way that we would judge these days? Possibly not, but certainly had the caring and pastoral knowledge and experience. That all comes out, that all comes to a head. The counselling mostly concludes, I mostly get myself on an even keel. I go to a prayer service and boom, we get the classic prayer for healing, pushed over, slain in spirit, and then suddenly I'm into an hour-long deliverance session. And so for me, from that moment, my mental health and that deliverance experience become intrinsically linked unhelpfully. And I think from that point on, in my very early 20s, 20-ish, there was an unhelpful connection between ideas of demonic possession and anything that was even remotely connected to subnormal mental health or mental health that wasn't normal. And that was deeply unhelpful for the rest of my Christian period, because I couldn't separate those two because of that personal experience that I had. And I think that's a danger. And I'm going to say it again. It's not just Christians that can be guilty of making that kind of mistake. You don't have to be a Christian to make that kind of linked mistake. But because that kind of deliverance thing is specifically Christian, I think that created a Christian problem for me.
Yeah, there are some things that we can all fall into commonly, Christian or unchristian, some unhelpful ideas of mental health. But I think that religion in particular and Christianity specifically has certain attributes that make it worse.
Yeah, and
So
for me, that was definitely true.
one of the things about the the way Christians have traditionally dealt with mental illness. And when I say Christians, I mean the Christians in the kinds of circles that I would run in. I know that there are lots more kinds of Christians out there. But what they would have been more likely to do is if you had, presented with some mental health issue, they would have called it a sin issue. And so they would be trying to root out your problem spiritually. And so, if anything, this makes your mental health issue worse because before you were depressed or hyperactive or whatever type of confusion you were. Now you're a sinner and you're probably going to burn in hell if you can't get your shit in order. So it makes it worse because it now has you thinking about your mental health in a way that is entirely unhealthy. And let me just say, even for you Christians out there hearing this, at least those that are a little bit more liberal among you would have to agree that turning a health issue into a sin issue is profoundly unhelpful and in fact profoundly damaging. And one of the things that I did in my said in my write-up is, whereas we skeptics are often guilty of implying that Christians are out of their mind in some way, Christians are just as bad, and they do it to us and they do it to themselves when they see a person who's acting out in a certain way and applies, rather than saying mental illness, they say satanic. But I've come to believe that by and large they are saying the same thing, but they're adding an additional gloss on it that makes the mental illness worse. So at least on the secular side, when we believe someone's mentally ill, we just say they're mentally ill. And when the Christians see someone that they believe is mentally ill, they apply a satanic gloss to it. And that's worse. It makes the problem worse. It doesn't make a person better. And it then forces them to, or encourages them to try to seek help in places where there is no help. Because in the same way that coming to me, if you have a mental illness, that you're coming to the wrong guy. I'm not a doctor. I will redirect you to a mental health professional. What the Christian does is they redirect a person, instead of to the mental health professional, to the priest. And they say you need to be prayed for, or you need to be exercised, or so. I do believe that in the Christian realm, it's worse. I think that it's worse, and I know that I might pay for these words come my panel on Saturday. But that concerns me very much, and I feel for anybody who's suffering from some type of undiagnosed condition. But I feel for them even more if they're caught up in a religion, because it's going to be worse for them, not better.
Yeah. Well, that's the argument of Carl Sagan's book, Demon Haunted World. I think you kind of alluded to that in your write-up, David. Historically, and that's his argument. He says, look, once you take that model from the New Testament, that most what we would call mental health disorders are due to a demonic presence, oppression, possession, whatever you want to call it, and the cure for that is exorcism of some sort. That model was adopted by the church for millennia, and there's been thousands and thousands of victims over the millennia who have been, unhelpfully diagnosed as having a demon possessing or oppressing them, and they've been, martyred, burned at the stake, put in prison, whatever, by priests and clerics. That's the model that's still around today, and that's basically what Carl Sagan's argument is, isn't it? That the quote unquote demon haunted world was demons were everywhere. Through medieval church and right up to almost even today, we still see a spiritual overlay in the church. Your mental health problems are probably caused by demonic oppression of some sort, and the cure for that is a spiritual one, and it's not going to be medication or counseling of a secular nature, because your Christian counselor is going to, tell you, well, we got to uncover the spiritual problem. Is there a generational curse here? What's happening? That's the problem. It's going to be some wacky diagnosis, and it's not going to help. Like Matthew's example, it's going to make it worse. That's my argument anyway.
So, it is not my intention to bash religion here, but it's also not my intention to dodge the issue. And having been a religious person for longer than I've been a secular person, I know that side of things better. Quite frankly, I'm still learning how to be secular. Quite frankly, and I think that's going to be something I'll be learning for a long time. As I look at religious people now, and I talk to a lot of religious people, obviously. I interact with them online. I used to do a lot of podcast interviews and things like that. We've had an opportunity to talk to religious people, and the older I get, and the further away I get from that world. Forgive me as I acknowledge that the crazier that world looks to me. It. I'm sorry, I'm just getting the dinner call. Try to keep it warm for me, because I'm in a podcast. Say hello to the audience. So,
Hello.
All right. The only reason I have not put it on Do Not Disturb is because I'm expecting a call from my attorney, and I can't afford to miss it. And so I might have to duck out for 2 minutes to take a call. But so yeah, the thing that keeps going through my mind as I interact with religious people is, how can I tell if I should continue talking to you as if you were, mentally healthy and stable, or if I should regard you as mentally ill or have with some type of mental incapacity that makes this conversation futile. It's very difficult because so much of Christianity depends on things. If you refer to my write-up, those of you who are listening, I list some things that I consider symptoms of mental illness. They're things that make me consider mental illness as a possibility. But that's the basics of Christianity, really. If you are, for instance, routinely talking to an invisible person, just take that outside of the context of religion for the moment, if you can. Someone is routinely talking to an invisible person, and they're not 6. You might suspect that this is a problem, but you add a religious gloss to it, and it's just prayer. It's just prayer. If you take that same person and they are convinced that that person is doing things and manipulating the universe to make their wishes come true, they might need a jacket. Yet you add a religious gloss to it. Once again, it's just God answering prayer.
Prayer requests.
How is that at all different? It's hard for me to see that. Now, obviously, I don't think that everyone who prays to God is some kind of nut job. All right. I don't believe that in my heart, but I've got a feeling that I am making some distinctions in my mind ad hoc that don't make sense. Because if you take away the religious gloss, I wouldn't think about that person the same way at all. And I don't think that adding religion to it somehow makes you more sane. So, how do you tell the difference, especially then when you get down to things like in Matthew? Please do not name any names or make it too obvious with what I'm going to say next. But if you believe, because there have been plenty of situations like this in the news, that God has told you to kill your child, whether you do it or don't do it, I promise, kind of like Spock said, you are emotionally compromised. You are mentally compromised somehow, and you cannot hide from that by saying, "No, I'm just obeying God." That we cannot make that an excuse. And if I'm talking to someone religiously who says that sort of thing, at what point should I put on the brakes and say, "Okay, I don't think that we should be having this conversation. I don't think that we're speaking as equals anymore here." And so there's a lot that goes, demons around every corner. This is hallucinogenic almost. At what point? How do we separate the person who is merely religious from someone who might have a problem, since so much of mere religion looks like a problem?
That's a really good point. And long before I heard you utter the phrase Abraham test, David, I had examined that story, and I think everybody who has exited Christianity has come to a point in their journey where that story comes across their mind and they spend some time thinking about it quite deeply. And before I heard you utter the phrase Abraham test, in fact, probably even before I knew of you, I'd already decided that the Abraham story was frightening. Is that your call?
It is, and I'm going to ask you to explain
We'll carry
briefly what
on.
the Abraham test is to Clint, and you guys carry on. This won't take long.
I'm sure you only need the phrase Abraham test, Clint, to understand what it is that we're talking about. But
I've preached
I
on
think
that passage.
have you?
Oh yeah.
So I think every person who deconstructs at some point arrives at this story and spends some time thinking about that story. And I'm pretty sure that most, maybe even all deconstructors have had a pivotal moment around that story. I don't see how people like myself who have fed that story so many times cannot focus and fixate on that story at some point in their journey and say, what do I do with this? And I very quickly came to the conclusion that the only righteous decision that Abraham could possibly have made was to say, no, I am not doing this. This is not a good thing to do, and move on. I don't think there is any other way that story can go for Abraham to be righteous. And I think the way that he's painted as a righteous person is horrifying.
Yeah. It says so much about if we take the narrative at face value that, let's say, God indeed commanded him to kill his only son. That's a whole other layer to this story, isn't it?
Yes.
That if it was truly God, that what does that say about God? And that Abraham did it.
Yes.
It's another level of insanity, madness.
It is absolutely.
It really is.
And this is where this brings me on to that thing that I was saying earlier about scales of mental cognitive capacity, because I'm trying to avoid using words like illness. It is perfectly I think somebody who looks at that story and still looks at it with the way that we did when we were Christians, as a glorious story of faithfulness to God, and possibly even would do the same themselves, I'm deeply uncomfortable with calling that person mentally ill if there's no other symptoms around. It is perfectly possible, perfectly reasonable for someone who is otherwise mentally stable and mentally healthy to be convinced that something horrific is actually something good. I think that is a reasonable thing to happen given the right criteria, that someone can be persuaded to act against what everybody else understands to be goodness while being mentally healthy. And I think linking that kind of behavior and assuming that the person who's doing it is mentally ill is a misstep. I don't think it is the right way to go. We need something else to diagnose mental illness. There could be other reasons why they get convinced into doing something horrific, which
Yeah,
don't mean mental poor health.
exactly. Well, I don't know if you heard that there's a Seth Andrews recording that he did. Maybe it's called the Abraham Test or something like that. It's like a short story, and he
Oh
narrates
yes,
it.
yes, yeah.
Yeah,
Yes, I heard that. That's brilliant. That retelling is absolutely brilliant. I love it.
yeah. So if that were to take place today, he would be arrested and put in prison for
Yes,
basically attempted murder.
yes,
And that, like a cult figure, he comes out of the wilds
mm,
of nowhere, and he's got his
yeah,
son. He's gonna stab him with a knife. He's mentally unhinged, we would say, and his defense is, but God told me to do it. That's not going to hold up in a court of law. You tried to kill your son, you're going to prison. Period. That's it. There's no defense
mm,
in a court of law that's going to work. And yeah, as you say, the gloss over the story, the sermon that I preach, was that you see, Matthew, it's not a story about mental unhealth or whatever. God knew all along in His
mm,
omniscience and foreknowledge that Abraham was not going to ever have to do it. He was going to provide the lamb and all the rest of it. So it is a wonderful story of faithfulness. I don't know what your
yeah.
objection is, and
That,
it's a forerunner of Christ's sacrifice on the cross. You see, the sacrificial lamb to take away the
mm.
sin of the world and all the rest of it. So it's got a lot of layers to it hermeneutically.
Yes, and I think there's something else that stems out of that story because of the way the narrative goes. Something that we would think is horrific, but actually ends out okay. And we never think about the impact of that experience on the
Mm-hmm.
child.
Yeah, how traumatic.
No one ever talks about what
Isaac.
happened there.
Yeah, what?
And
How traumatized is Isaac?
yes,
Oh,
exactly.
hey Isaac, what did you do today? Oh well, we went out
Yeah.
into the wilderness. My dad tied me up, tried to stick a
Mm,
knife in my heart. Are you
yeah.
okay? I mean, that's pretty
Yes,
fucked
quite.
up.
Absolutely. And I've had conversations with Christians where we've talked about something where someone was planning to do something that we would agree was horrific, but the horrific thing didn't happen. Something good happened instead. So it's kind of good
Yeah,
inverted commas. So it's kind of like almost a parallel to the Abraham story.
right. God
And
intended it for good.
I've said what they were intending to do was terrible, and the response has been, but it didn't happen, did it? Everything's fine. And I'm trying to say, well, no, actually, everything is not fine because there was horrific motive. The motivations behind wanting to do that horrific thing have not gone. It could still happen again. And we haven't actually solved the underlying issue. And the response is, well, it didn't happen. Everything's fine. No, it's not fine.
You're
If
missing the
somebody
point.
if somebody tries to drive their car at a crowd of people with the intention of killing someone, but say something goes wrong, they get a burst tire and the car goes off course and nobody dies, it's not okay. You know
Yeah, it's still not
that
okay.
driver, that driver tried to do something horrific, tried to do something awful.
Yeah,
We need to try to work out what that problem is and fix that so there is no temptation to try it again. Just because nobody died doesn't mean it's okay.
yeah. Well, and going back to David's point, now that you're back, you talked about how this is my argument that so much of religion actually causes mental health problems. And I'll give you some examples in my own life. So, Matthew, you were sharing your own testimony earlier. I'll give my testimony. I mean, I was raised in a fundamentalist Christian Church of Christ in the Seattle, Washington area in the 70s. I was forced to watch the movie A Thief in the Night when I was a kid. That movie gave me such what we call rapture anxiety. And I would say now I had and probably still have religious trauma syndrome from my fundamentalist upbringing. That is a thing. I know you could talk to Dr. Marlene Winnell. She's written a whole book on religious trauma syndrome and the treatments behind it. So that's one example how religion causes mental health. And then I read an article by Dr. Candace Gorham, and she's a therapist. Now, the interesting thing about Candace Gorham, she's a secular therapist, but a lot of her clients over the decades that she's been treating them are actually evangelical Christians, and they kind of secretly go to her because they don't want to admit that they've got mental health problems. And over the years, she categorized the 2 or 3 or 4 most common mental health problems that evangelicals have, her clients. And the number one is depression, number two is anxiety, and the third is hell-induced PTSD. And it's just like a litany over and over and over. She sees the same exact symptoms in her evangelical clients, and they're seeking help from a secular therapist. And she said in this article, basically, this isn't a coincidence, that all of these people have the exact same mental health problems, and it's caused by their religion, you know. So that's a thing where my argument is I think it causes a lot of mental health problems.
Yeah, I don't think it's benign.
No.
So while we are still here and upright and conscious,
Are you sure we're all three of those?
I'm
Don't take
speaking
too offense, David.
I'm speaking optimistically here. I want
Yeah.
to do a little bit of belly gazing. I want to turn a little bit introspective, and I have been dreading this for a while, and I've enjoyed the conversation so far. I'm not going to enjoy this part at all, and I can't ask you to even consider doing it if I'm not willing to do it, and I don't want to do it. But what I'm going to do is vaguely, with some heavy generalizations, caveats, and so forth, talk about some of my own damage. And why am I going to do that? Well, because there could be a subset of people who listen to my shows, read my blogs, have followed me in my skeptical career for a few years, and they might think that I have it all together. They might even be silly enough to look up to me. This is a bad thing. Do not do it. But they might have a wrong impression of me, and that might further compound their own doubts about themselves. Because one of the things that can happen is if you have a problem that no one else is talking about, you start questioning your own sanity. You know, am I crazy? Is there something wrong with me? Am I the only one? No, you're not the only one. You're not crazy. You're not alone. And we need to be a little bit more transparent, I think, about our own damage if we're going to stir a useful conversation that will help more people discover and address their damage. The preacher talked about being real with yourself. People don't even have the tools to be real with themselves. They don't even know what mental illness is or what it looks like, and it's very hard to do the kind of introspection that would reveal your own damage. So I want to talk about a little bit of my own damage. Talk about some things that I never talk about, and I think I'm just stalling now.
Do you want one of us to go first, David?
No, it wouldn't be right. It wouldn't be right. So let me start with my family, because I think this is where mental illness begins. Matt has been very honest about some of the damage taken through family. But you see, when you have a family that kind of publicly explodes, then that kind of takes the stigma off of you. Everybody knows that you're fucked up. Your family's fucked up. Nobody looks up to your family. So it doesn't mean anything. Yeah. Yeah, my dad was caught having a third affair again. I mean, so everybody knows it anyway, so it's no big deal. You're the lucky one. You're the lucky one. The unlucky ones are the people who have to carry family secrets. I carry dark, deep family secrets that I can't even talk about. And you can ask, who am I trying to protect, me or them? Maybe both, I don't know. But we're talking about the kinds of family secrets that would put people in jail for life. Family secrets. And I'm talking about my immediate family. Not my wife, she's fine. She's perfect. I'm talking about the family I grew up in. By the way, if she wasn't perfect, I wouldn't tell you. So, because she's my wife. So, one of the things that I struggled with in the lead up to this program, in fact, for many years, is how much of myself I can even share, because so much of it is tied up in my family. And so, at what point am I telling my own secrets, which I can tell, or someone else's secrets, which are not mine to tell? And then one has to consider the potential damage that can be caused by telling the truths you know. Because honesty is the best policy is a nice bumper sticker, but it's not the case so much of the time. It just isn't. So I have no real marriage to honesty. Honesty is a tool. You can use it when it's appropriate, and you should avoid it when it's not. That said, even now, as the words are about to come out of my mouth, I'm trying to figure out how much of it I can say and how much of it I can't. But just let me process it out. There'll be some awkward pauses. All right, I'll tell you a little bit about one of the milder, actually, the mildest thing that I can think to share. This happened when I was an adult, actually, out of the house. I was in a phase where I was doing okay financially, and my parents weren't doing so well, but they had a house, and we decided, you know what, let's just, since we can't get my parents to come and live with me, let's go live with them for a while, and we'll pay, the rent or whatever we do, we'd do that, because this is a way that they would let me take care of them. So during one of those, during some of that time, also the other thing that people might know about me, I'm deep into computers. So computer geekery is one of my geekdoms. It's not even the biggest one, but it's one of my geekdoms. And I know how to repair them and work on them, things like that. So my father had me look at his computer because he was having some kind of trouble that he couldn't diagnose, and as I was working on it, one of the problems was messages. He was having trouble with his message syncing, something like that. And I inadvertently saw some of those messages. And you can't unsee it without describing the contents of them. I can say that, even though I'm well into my adulthood at this time, it undid every good thing I thought came from my childhood, because my father was not the person I thought he was. And he is not the person that his many church friends thinks he is. He's a very important minister, or at least he was, and he still is that reputation. He is not who they think he is. And I had to go on with my repair and with that day and with the rest of my life pretending that I didn't know that. And the thing is, it had already come out in our family, privately in our family, some of the things that he was up to. So this was after the bigger revelations. And I managed to ride that out, but this one floored me. And I think that I held it together very well, and I'm very stoic about a lot of things, but I can tell you that from that day on, I have been emotionally compromised and quite a bit Looney Tunes. And there's no undoing it. It's not. There's no fixing it. There's no self fix. There's counselors haven't fixed it. There's no. It fucked me up. And one of the things that it changed in my outlook, I no longer look at any human beings as if they were decent. And if there are people that I do look up to as decent, I just don't believe it. You're just a scumbag in disguise. How does that help me associate with people? Not well. I hate people. This is another thing that you may not know about me, but I say it to my wife all the time because she knows some of the ways that I'm fucked up. I despise human beings. So I don't want to see the world go up in conflagration. I need human beings to make my Big Macs. So I'm not going to make them myself. So the world needs human beings. I need them, but I don't want to associate with them. I don't want to know them. I don't want to like them. I will never be able to look at human beings again in a purely innocent way anymore. Now, I'm telling you this with all of its vagaries, and I tell you this is the mildest of the things I carry with me. If I were to talk more boldly about things, I might talk about things like sexual abuse. I might open the kimono of other aspects of my family and other things that they have done that has caused some of my more basic faculties for relating with people to be permanently scrambled. I might talk about some of those things if I had more of a spine, but I don't. And so all I can do is assure you that whatever thing haunts you from your childhood or teens or even early adulthood, I have just as much of it. And it may look like I'm dealing with it. I assure you, I am not. I'm not well. I'm never going to be well. And I will never have the illusion again that I'm well. Now, I don't know what to do about it because I present well, and shrinks are happy to send me away without bottles of medication. So I'm fine. I'm better off than a lot of people in the world, apparently. But I am as fucked up a person as I know. And I suspect it only gets worse from here, not better. Hey, okay. Would anyone else like to join in, or have? Are you too wise to? No judgment here,
Yeah.
but I think it's important, especially for people who all of us do shows. Guys, we're not just people who are on a show from time to time. We're not just people who make a comment from time to time. Whether you think of yourself is it or not, whether you have a large following or not, you are leaders in your community. And we have a higher responsibility to be transparent. So I am offering you this opportunity, but I will not judge you if you're too chicken shit.
In the spirit of things, I think it's only fair and proper. I made allusions to coming from a broken home as a child and all the crap that went on after that. Both my parents remarried, and my brothers and I have spectacularly fallen out with both of the partners. My mum died more than 10 years ago now, and the one glorious thing that came from that tragedy was I no longer need to see or communicate with or have any dealings with the man that she spent almost 20 years married to. I'm very happy that he is no longer in my life, but that is not a gleeful happiness. That is a happiness that carries with it a burden, that my brothers bore far more than me, because I never had the displeasure of living under his roof because I had already left home by that time. And so there is that. At some point, I'm going to have to deal with the woman my dad married for dealing with his estate. It is not something I'm looking forward to, and I'll probably be an extremely unpleasant person towards her because of crap that has happened in life. I don't think it is possible for me to be a nice or pleasant person to her. But we shall see what happens then. I do like to try to be nice to people. I am not always nice. I am not the model of the graceful atheist, like somebody who we all know who goes under that moniker, who deserves to go under that moniker. I do not deserve that moniker, and I will never pretend to aspire to it. I can be a proper cunt sometimes on Twitter because I see things and I see statements, and I will jump in and I will respond to the nastiness that I see with appropriate nastiness. Not because I enjoy being that kind of nastiness, but because I know what it's like to be on the receiving end of nastiness. And so me jumping in and doing that is to distract attention from the real targets, because I know in the deconstruction space, there are a great many people who are hurting more than I am, who are traumatized more than I am, who can cope with the crap that they have to deal with a lot less well than I am. So if I can attract some of that ire, some of that attention, then it means I hope that somebody else doesn't. And for me, that is the win, because frankly, most of the time I can take it. But to get more personal, as David did, I come from a broken home. And coming from a deeply unhappy, traumatizing, with the extra banner of religion, broken home, taints you for the rest of your life. It focuses every relationship that you have. It makes you question every relationship that you have, especially a marital relationship, especially one that breaks up, because you know what that does to a child. And when I was deconstructing and going through it, and seeing the attrition rate of marriages, because let's be frank about it, in the deconstruction space where there are marriages and only one deconstructs, the chance of that marriage surviving are extraordinarily low. There are way too many marriages out there, or healthy relationships, or even parent-child relationships that have been horrifically rent apart as a result of someone trying to be honest and deconstruct in the most compassionate and honest way they can. And all they get from it is a massive, great big slap on the cheek from people who they love, from people who they trust, from people who they thought would treat them better, and only to find out that love, after all, is conditional. And so I carried this, and it still haunts me. 15 years later, I am still married. My wife and I do still love each other. We still do have tender moments together, and we still do promise commitment to each other. But it hasn't been smooth, and I'm not going to go into any details, so please don't hang on and slow this down for gory details. There will be no gory details, just the acknowledgement that it is challenging, that it is difficult. And on top of all of that, I know what a broken marriage does to a teenager. And the thought of doing that to my own child genuinely rips my heart in two. How could I be so selfish as to do that to my child? How could I be so selfish as to want happiness if I'm in an unhappy place? Let's say, for example, it's not, but let's just say, for example, my marriage wasn't happy and I wanted to find happiness. That happiness would come at the cost of tormenting my daughter with the same torment that I had throughout the entirety of my teenage years. How does a parent who loves their child do that to their child? I don't know the answer to that terrible conundrum, and maybe my own parents had exactly that same terrible conundrum, but I never had the opportunity to talk about that with my mother, and I don't have the quality of relationship with my father to be able to have that conversation. So this is what that does, and this is the torment that happens. This breakup of my parents' marriage happened almost 40 years ago, and look at me. I'm still racked by it. It still affects me. It still has the power to bring me to tears when I least expect it. Thank you for that, David. You owe me big time. But this is what it does. And if you are in anywhere near close to the same situation, you are not weak. You are not broken. You are not mentally ill. You are just a person who's carrying shit, and you're doing your best to deal with it. But for goodness sake, do not, whatever you are, believe the lie that you are broken or worthless or useless or any other negative adjective that you can think of, because you're not.
Well, Clint, it's left to you.
Cheer me
Well,
up, dude. I'm relying on you.
I probably don't have good news for you. I would just say that, yeah. So my parents were married; they didn't get divorced, but a lot of this shit came out when I was about 7 or 8, 9 years ago. It turned out that my father, he basically was a pedophile, and he abused my two oldest sisters for sure that we know about. And in the all the stuff that went on around the revelations coming out quite late in his life, I ended up having to break my relationship off with my mother for similar reasons. She was too toxic, and they're both good. They were both good evangelicals and all that. And I haven't spoke with my mom in probably 8 or 9 years now, and I had to do that because she was that toxic. She turned around and blamed us, his victims, for framing an innocent man and all that kind of nonsense. So when I put all those pieces together with the religious trauma syndrome that I suffered as a child, growing up in a fundamentalist home, and my parents, they took us to church. They were the ones who laid a lot of this stuff on me as a kid, and my sisters. I look at my journey now, coming out of Christianity. It's a long journey of not just deconstruction but reconstruction. So if I have mental health issues, which I certainly do, um, I'm trying to get help when I start to see the problems come up. I mean, recently at work, I've just in the process of quitting my job, and the reason I quit my job is because I realized that the environment in which I was working was affecting my mental health in a negative way. And I realized I could no longer stay there because it was a gaslighting kind of environment. It was really fucking my head up. And I had to quit. Even though part of the job I really enjoyed, I had to get out of there because it was affecting me so negatively. And since I made those kind of decisions in the process, I got therapy and counseling, and that was a massive help to do that because it made me see what was the actual issues there. And it wasn't a religious thing. It wasn't. I didn't pray about it. I didn't seek divine guidance. I got therapy from work, and she helped me see that it was affecting my mental health. And I quit my job. I've been there for 4 years, but I had to get out of there. So I don't know if that cheers it cheers up Matthew, but in a way, it helps me because I think if life is that bad, if you're in the shit that bad, you need to make a change, get out, change your circumstances. I recently got divorced about 2 years ago, realizing that we were both really unhappy, and we made a massive change, and it was traumatic and stressful and everything else. But I feel like my life and my ex's life is way, way, far, far better off doing that. And it wasn't because we both deconstructed or one deconstructed and the other one didn't, but we just went separate directions. So shit happens, man. I mean, you just move on and deal with it as best you can. Get the help, get the therapy that you can.
So
It's all part of the journey.
let's go there next as we round the corner here, because we can't leave it in this condition. We can't leave the audience in this condition. We can't leave me in this condition. Damn it. So, what I would like to know is what should a person do if they suspect that they have a problem? Now, first of all, it's very hard to suspect that you have a problem, but I can assure you that if there's some major shit that's happened in your life, you probably do. You probably have a problem. And so that's the first thing. You just look at the events in your life and stop thinking that you are the one person who can avoid damage when those things happen. You are not. You are not the one person who could avoid damage. We've taken some damage, and so that said, once a person has gotten real with themselves, what next? Now, I'm fairly sure that no one is going to give the advice to go to your church and ask for prayer. At least not on part one. And I'm not even sure because I know these cats on the other side. I'm not even sure that they would recommend that you go to your church for prayer. For anyone wondering, we've got Marvin, we've got David Russell, former co-host of Skeptics and Seekers, and we've got Randall Rouser, a friend of the show and a friend of me. And so I honestly don't know what they're going to say, but I don't think they're going to say whatever you think the traditional Christian thing that you might expect is. So, but we're a bunch of secularists, and we're just as fucked up. So where do you go? I have, I don't talk about it, but I've seen professionals. I am apparently fine. Whatever. So, but I don't buy it. There's some days when I feel like I'm just barely hanging on, and much of this day was one of them, to be quite frank. And I don't know. I don't have any. I think this is. I wish Andrew was here for this part of the conversation because I think all of us expressed something like this. But this is why mental health issues feel different than other health issues. Because if I had arrhythmia, You know, if my Apple Watch told me, "Hey, you seem to be having arrhythmia," perhaps you see a doctor. I know exactly what doctor to go to. They know exactly what to do. We're not in the dark about our own condition when certain things happen. I know that I have some mental damage. I don't know what to do. I don't know what the healthiest things are for me to do besides, see a professional. Call a friend. I have no idea what to do. And I don't feel at liberty enough to just reveal all of the family secrets that I carry around like a bag of bricks. So, what do you do? What do you do, Matt? Clint, you're fucked up, man. You are fucked up. What do you do? I mean, you are obviously everyone on the show but me are raging alcoholics. But I mean, what else? So
The only problem is I haven't got any. It's gone.
so honestly, this is my honest state of confusion. I will be pulling no rabbit out of the hat here. And I'm just at this state where I just want to acknowledge that I don't know what to do. And I feel this is one of the places where Christians will have the rhetorical advantage because they can pretend like they've got solutions. They've got their pretend solutions. We don't have any of that shit. So you two, what do you tell your audience? What do you do?
Talking is always a good thing, I think, but it needs to come with a but, and that but is a trust relationship. Don't just talk to anybody. I certainly wouldn't go to a Christian therapist for any of my issues because of the history that I have with religion. So that would be a no-go for me. But you as an individual, if you are somebody seeking help, you need to answer that question for yourself. I can't answer that one for you. But it doesn't necessarily have to be a professional. Maybe it's good enough for you to have a close friend and just once a week, you meet for a day, you go for a walk, and you talk things through just to get another perspective. It may be that after that point, you need to go and see somebody who's more professional, who's more got the skills for helping you sort through whatever it is that you've got. But you don't have to go there straight away. Find someone that you can trust. Find someone you've got that trust relationship with where you can say literally what the hell you want to, and there'll be a safe person for you. Those things. There are phone lines both in the USA and in the UK and in other European countries. We call it the Samaritans here, but there are probably other places, although caveat, the Samaritans is mostly a Christian-backed organization. But there are other phones other numbers that you could call if you need some form of help. I believe the Secular Alliance or somebody like that over in the USA has got something. Andrew will be able to throw the number out if he was here on the call. So there are also people you can call for young people here in the UK. We've got Childline. It's a secular charity. They do excellent work. I had a conversation with my daughter because she was concerned about somebody else that she was chatting to, and my daughter was doing her best to help her. And I said to my daughter quite bluntly, I said, look, darling, I know you're doing your best to help, but you're a teenager yourself. You're ill-equipped. Tell her to call Childline and have that conversation. It won't appear on the phone bill. It won't cost any money. You'll be fine. Nobody needs to know that the conversation is happening, and she'll get proper help and probably put into contact with somebody else. And so that conversation was had. So someone who is appropriate. So two specific examples, neither of which involve any therapy. One is me personally. Around about 10 years ago, I was in a really, really low spot and struggling. I got low enough that I noticed that it was affecting my day-to-day behavior. And it was behavior that I didn't particularly enjoy. I didn't want to behave like that, but it was affecting my behavior in a negative way to a point that I noticed and I didn't like it. And that was how I got involved in acting. You two now know that I do involved acting. People who listen to my podcast know that I get involved in acting. It's great. We put on 2 shows a year, although lockdown has mixed that up somewhat. But being involved in acting might not be your thing. If something else is your thing, do that thing. For me, it was prancing about on stage and being a complete utter show off. But having to learn lines and then trust other people to learn lines and do stage movements together and have that trust in another human being took the focus of my brain off what was that was bothering me and put my focus on something else. And doing that over a prolonged period just got me into a different way of thinking, and I was able to climb out of what it was that was bothering me. So sometimes you can do that. Sometimes you can self-medicate, if that's how we want to call it, and simply focus our mind onto something else, find a hobby. For me, it's being with other people. For other people, it might be something that's on their own. It might be woodwork. Clint, you talk about woodwork. For somebody, it might be in the pleasure of crafting something that takes months, literally months to do, from a block of ugly wood to something utterly handmade and beautiful that's polished. And maybe it'll take them 6 months, a year, 2 years to make, but they've put love in it and they focused on it, and that gets them out. For me, that wouldn't work for me. You would rather see the lump of tree than what I would make out of it, believe me. But on stage, apparently, I've got the ability to entertain people so long as there are others around. And that whole community aspect, learning lines, acting with people, the laughing and the joking and the humor when we're going through rehearsals, the utter seriousness of the performance week. And then when it all breaks up, everyone goes, "Oh, thank fuck, that's over." And then we have the party and talk about it and all that. And it's love it. And it energizes me. I absolutely love it. And so if there's anything that's bothering me, that focus gets me off it. So that's one option. Find your thing, do your thing, get your mind off it. Another
Something
example,
positive. Yeah.
absolutely. Another thing I can mention is, and again, huge caution and huge caveats behind this, but somebody I know was genuinely struggling with really, really severe mental health. There was lots of trauma that triggered it. You don't need to know the details. And this really good friend of mine, he was put on antidepressants. He was on antidepressants for a while. And one of the downsides of one of the side effects of antidepressants is they kind of compress your mood. And for this particular friend of mine, after being on them for several months, they were becoming counter-interactive. You know, his normal mood just wasn't working, and he while he wasn't experiencing what he was experiencing, what he'd become wasn't what he was either because of the effect of the antidepressants. And I was visiting one day, and he said, "I've stopped taking my antidepressants." I said, "You know what? I had noticed a change in you. You're more normal than you were before." And he said, "Yeah, I slowly cut them down, and I've been off them for a week." And I said, "Okay." Well, I said, "Promise me this. Leave it another week, then tell your wife, because you can't hide this from her. If you hide this for more than another week, it'll be a problem. So just do it for another week. Just prove to yourself that you're all right. Then tell your wife, come clean, and talk a strategy together and work it through and talk it through and talk the way you're thinking, because you need some honesty. You need continuity there. And if on top of all of that, you're deceiving her, things won't be good." Fortunately, that was good advice, because he followed that advice and it genuinely helps. And they sorted things out. She realized that actually maybe those antidepressants were good, and they worked to plan, and they went and worked things out for the next stage of their relationship and what medication, etc. And it all came good. But if you're going to take that route, please be very, very careful and make sure you talk to somebody about it, and make sure that it's not very long before you're talking to a medical professional. I'm not a medical professional. Sometimes antidepressants really are a good thing. So be aware and be very careful if that is a road you're going to take, because I am absolutely not putting that as a do-all for this individual, because I knew them very well. I felt brave enough that this was probably a good way to do it. But this isn't going to work for everybody. So huge caution there. But sometimes you can just tell in yourself how you're feeling. I did in that position. My good friend did in his position. We were able to recognize the changes in ourselves and be able to tell what we liked and what we didn't like, and that we had to make a change to do something, and we worked out the change and it came good with communication to other people. And I think that's probably the key in all of that. But try and be aware of yourself, spot where things not going right, because if you've got issues with mental health, I'm pretty sure that your behavior, the way you're thinking, is going to be affected. So be aware of that in yourself is probably the only honest advice I can give.
Clint?
Yeah, good advice. Well, I would say the two biggest things, the two biggest factors, maybe three, off the back of what Matthew said. One is therapy. I've gotten therapy and counseling, and mostly to do with my religious trauma syndrome and the associated traumas and issues, and how that's affected my not only my mental health but the way I interact with other people, being triggered by things. So a lot of that is my journey out of evangelical Christianity, getting therapy and counseling. The other piece of that is education. So I've read loads of books on cult psychology. Marlene Winnell's Leaving the Fold. I could list dozens of books that I've read, and it's helped me, I think, craft a kind of approach to therapy. So when I went through Vanderkolk's, that book I mentioned earlier, The Body Keeps the Score, one thing I realized was that when he talked about EMDR and internal family systems, IFS, those are two of the better treatment modes for PTSD and religious trauma syndrome. So that's my next journey. I want to find a therapist who does EMDR and IFS therapy, because I think, okay, I've never tried that before, but I've learned through my research and reading on this topic that those are good sort of treatment modalities. So that's kind of where I'm going with my own treatment, but I need to seek a professional. I don't know how. You can't do it by yourself. You need someone who can guide you through that process. And then what Matthew said is true, finding a positive hobby or activity that brings you joy. So for me, it's building furniture or things like that. I love making things with my hands, and I could just lose myself in being in the workshop all week and completely lose track of time and just be in the zone. Things like writing, doing my podcast, those are things that I love to do. I wish I could get paid more I'd rather do that than work my normal job, but it's a positive thing, things that you love to do that replace the negativity that we were influenced by and maybe still can be triggered by, I think, as adults. So those are the kind of three big things that I found to be very helpful.
Thank you. It's time for closing statements. Now, let me just make this very clear. Clint, a closing statement is not a question.
I love questions, though.
It's not a conversation.
Damn it.
It is a soapbox. Furthermore, I'm going to ask for yours first, but I'm going to help you ease into your closing statement because you're not used to thinking in this way. I understand that. So I am going to ask each of us, to incorporate the answer to this question in your closing statement. And the question is, there is another show coming up in a few days, and it will have some fine Christian minds there. What would you like to ask them? What do you want to hear them answer for you? So take that question, wrap it up into your closing statement. It will be Clint, Matthew, and me, and I will be cheating my closing statement because I've already written it and I'm going to have Clint read it. So I'm not even going to give my closing statement. So Clint, take it away.
Okay, well, it's going to be a question because you just said to ask him a question. So I'm damned if I do, damned if I don't. You heard him say that, didn't you, Matthew? Well, I want to hear him talk about a couple questions, couple of issues. Do they see their religion as Christians causing mental health problems? And if so, what do you do about that? And the other issue is this issue of the layering of the spiritual on top of what we might consider secularly as a diagnosable mental health problem. As a Christian, How do you view that? What do you see that as is it a spiritual cause? What's the root cause of your supposed mental health issues? If you're a Christian, how do you deal with that? Because that's as we've been talking about in the show. For me, I would say the reconstruction part of my deconstruction has been to, I guess you could say, secularize my mental health issues. I don't ascribe any spiritual causes to any of them. They all have valid, legitimate explanations. I just need to figure out what it is that's causing my, traumas and things, and that starts to affect the way I interact with other people and the way I view myself, my own mental health. So, for example, when I was talking about earlier, I'm quitting my job because I saw that it was affecting my mental health. So I needed to make a change and get out of that environment and go into another job, which hopefully will be a more positive environment in terms of my own mental health. So my self care became the most important thing at that point, my own mental self care. So, whatever you have to do, if you're in a situation where you need to get out of a relationship or a job or whatever the situation is, you've got to protect your own mental health. No one's going to do it for you. Get therapy, get counseling, get some education around that. I would say that's the best advice I could give someone. I don't know if that qualifies as a closing statement, but that's my statement. I'm sticking to it.
It fits in the fine tradition of S&S
Oh, good.
closing statements. Matt.
I'm going to repeat partially what I'd already said: is talk to someone. If there's a issue that you think you've got, talk to someone, find someone, make it a friend, talk to them, and then plan next what you're going to do from there. In terms of a question, there's so many cheeky or pointed questions I'd love to ask, but I'm going to tone that down, and I'm going to go to something that we touched on earlier in this conversation, and that is about there are a great deal number of Christians who take the attitude that mental health assistance, counselling, if you were, they will only ever consider a Christian therapist for that. And I don't fully understand why that is, whether it's fear of secularized world or not. I'm in danger of putting answers into people's mouths, and I don't want to be guilty of that. But I'm just wondering, why do they think that is the case? And if they want to be brave enough, do they think that is a healthy position to be in?
Excellent question. So I will go ahead and share my question because that is not in the write-up. But I will share my question, and then I will ask Clint to read my statement because I don't feel stable enough to read it myself right now. And Clint has it all together. So that's
Yeah.
so.
This is all smoke and mirrors, my friend.
But my question that I bring to the show is how, as a Christian, as one of the good guys, and one of the really smart people in the world, how do you tell the difference between someone who maybe is just wrong about the world and needs some guidance and better answers, and someone who is possibly mentally ill? With when they say God told me to drown my baby, the assumption is, well, why are you even bringing that example up? Obviously, that person is mentally ill. It is not obvious to me from a religious perspective. Because if the person had said, God told me to give that waitress $50 for a tip, no one would say she was mentally ill. And so the only difference in those two situations is the message God told them to give. But you see, from my perspective as a secularist, I would say if God is telling you anything, that seems to be a sign of mental illness, and the Christian would not say that. And so, for the Christian, how can you tell what what are you using to distinguish, someone who's just healthy but wrong and someone who's maybe not healthy? And what are you doing to maybe weed out those problems and deal with those problems in your churches? When people may be there, getting excellent cover for what would otherwise be a treatable mental illness. So, at any rate, that's me. And now, for me.
Okay, here's the write up that David sent. It says, this write up should cover the first hour of podcast conversation. I leave it to the panelists to fill in the rest. This is a subject about which I have no expertise. I do, however, encounter mentally ill people frequently. Some are obviously mentally retarded on a field trip with a group. Other encounters are not so obvious and much more fraught. The other time I encounter mental illness is when I look in the mirror. I think back on the many influences in my life that led me to this point. Many of those influences and experiences were not good. They left scars. I took damage. On that, I will say no more. I am just one of the countless damaged humans wandering Manhattan in search of the perfect hot dog. The adventures I collect along the way are priceless and disturbing. I am weirdly encouraged by the idea that mental damage seems to be the norm rather than something that is unique to myself. I am even overly proud that I am not among the worst sufferers. But then, in the quiet of the morning, after shaking off unspeakable dreams, I am faced with the man in the mirror. That is when I am most certain that none of us have escaped the worst of the mental damage. I've seen shrinks, and they seem happy to let me go on my merry way without medication. So here we are, me in that goddamn mirror, shuddering at the thought of what those shrinks might have missed. Like I said, this exploration is fucking hard. See you in the comments, David Johnson.
And with that, we will see you in the comments. Bye-bye.